Good afternoon, good day, good morning, wherever you are. You are here from few continents, so happy to have you here, and happy to have Professor Christoph Knill with us. Christoph Knill is one of the leading political scientists, public policy analysts in the world, acting in the world today. He's taking a comparative approach, so he's doing comparative public administration, comparative policy analysis. He's based in Munich, and he's a chair of the political science and public administration there. He wrote many influential books, including The Europeanization of National Administrations, Environmental Policy Convergence in Europe, On the Road to Permissiveness, Change and Convergence of Moral Regulation in Europe. And of course, the books that we will present today, Policy Accumulation and the Democratic Responsiveness Trap. And he also, together with Xavier Fernandez and Yves Steinbach, collaborator of his, just published excellent, what seems to be as a very promising paper in the American Political Science Review, studying policy design quality in comparative perspective. I very much recommend going and having a look there. They did an index on policy design or menu of interest instruments and so on. I still have to dig into the paper, but it looks exciting. Christoph is also all the ERC grant, a second grant. This is your second or third grant, Christoph? The second. There will be, my feeling is it will be a third one. So I wish you third one, and I trust you can do it if you want, because I know it's tiring. So Christoph, thank you very much to coming with us, giving this talk, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, David, for inviting me to this very interesting series. And yeah, I just share my screen. I can't. How does it work? Can you allow me to share my screen?
Ah. Yes, now you can.
Okay. Okay, sorry. So now you should see my presentation. Okay, so yeah, what I'm talking about is a project that is funded by the European Research Council, and it's called Policy Accumulation and the Democratic Responsiveness Trap. And part of this work have been published in a recent book with Cambridge University Press. You see here the book cover, and it's a joint publication with Christian Adam, Steffen Hurka, Yves Steinbach, and myself, where we, could say this is one of the first publications out of this ERC project. So what is the structure of my talk? I will first briefly introduce what we understand by policy accumulation, and also try to show why this is a novel perspective on policy change and how this is distinct from existing perspectives. Second, I will briefly talk about drivers of policy accumulation, so what are the causes of policy accumulation. Third, turn to the consequences of policy accumulation, and this is where the so-called responsiveness trap comes in, and discuss some of potential negative effects of policy accumulation for modern democracies, and finally turn to the question what we can do about it, whether we can stop accumulation or how we can handle policy accumulation. So now let's start with the first point. What is the perspective on policy accumulation, why this is a novel perspective on policy change. So what's important to emphasize, if you look into classical textbooks of public policy, if you also look into the major journals of dealing with public policy, such as Policy Studies Journal, for instance, what you find is a dominant view on individual policies. So focus on individual instances of policy change. So why did certain countries change their gun policy? Why did they change their clean air policy? Why this, or even look only at one country and policy change over time. So the major unit of analysis is the individual policy in a given country or given set of countries, or sometimes you compare maybe 2 or 3 different policy issues or policies. So what you usually find, the central theoretical interest is decision-making, formulation, and implementation of individual policies, and the most familiar theoretical frameworks you find is advocacy, coalition framework, multiple streams approach, punctuated equilibrium theory. So these are the classical approaches. But that is the central argument in our book, or also in the project. What you miss when you focus on these individual instances of policy change, that you miss out the aggregate effects of individual changes. So how do these individual changes over time, what is the aggregate effect? How do they sum up in a certain way? You know? And you have some, there are some arguments in the literature. There is, of course, a work by David and also by Knill. Together, you worked on this, also on this increase in the number of legislation, in the number of regulations. There is an argument in the public policy literature that is about the increasing complexity of policy mixes. So there is certain feeling, of course, that there's an aggregation effect, that overall in given sectors, policies over time are getting more and more complex. There's also recently an argument made by Susanne Mettler about so-called policy scapes, or she emphasizes so-called policy maintenance problems. So the argument here is that once you have policies in place, these policies over time need maintenance, need updating, need certain additional measures for coordination amongst different actors, stakeholders involved. So there are, let's say, additional costs that come along with existing policies, creating, again, new policies. So this is also one argument that indicates that there are certain aggregate effects that lead to an increase in numbers of policies, increase in policy complexity. And there is also this argument by Hacker and Thelen about institutional, also policy layering, so that the typical pattern of policy change is not substitution of policy A by a new policy B, but it's more that you add new layers to already existing policies. So there is certain evidence or certain signs that there is an overall increase in the number of policies, the tendency of growing complexity, of increase in number of policies, regulations over time. So far, that is our argument. There's not so much out in the literature how you can systematically measure such developments in terms of policy outputs. There are arguments, you count legislation, you count regulations. That is one approach. What this does not tell us exactly is concretely how many new policy targets are in place, how many new policy instruments are in place in order to measure, for instance, the burden for implementation that comes along with such policies. So that is basically what we are focused on when talking about policy accumulation. We focus on what we refer to as policy elements. Policy elements, I will come to that in a minute. That means a continuous policy accumulation is defined as the continuous addition of new policy elements to a given policy portfolio without compensatory reduction of already existing policy elements. So policy accumulation occurs if you adopt more new policies than abolishing existing ones. Now, what do we mean by policy element? For us, a policy element is a combination of two things. On the one hand, policy target. So what is addressed? So what is the target that is that a policy is focusing on? For instance, if you talk about environmental policy, this could be, for instance, CO2 emissions from cars, or NOx emission from large combustion plants, or certain emissions into the water whatsoever. So you can find these would be specific targets of a certain policy. And these targets can be achieved in theory by a range of different instruments. So for instance, if you want to reduce CO2 emissions into the air, you can use obligatory standards, you can rely on economic incentives, or you might even simply rely on some information requirements or persuasive instruments. So there's a range of different instruments you can usually think of in order to achieve a certain, or to address a certain policy target. So each change on this, every addition of a new target would mean that we have at least one new policy element. And if this target is addressed by, let's say, 5 or 6 different instruments, or every new instrument would count again as a new policy element. Yeah? So that means that when we talk about policy accumulation, we systematically assess changes in the number of policy elements for a given country and a given policy field over time. And that is the basic idea, and I just try to show you in more detail how this looks if we try to apply this. So what we did, and more or less we rely now on 3 larger projects. There is the consensus project that has been funded in the 5th framework program of the European Commission. And there are the 2 ERC grant projects, one on the Morapol project, where we focus on morality policies, and Accupol, which is again, like the consensus project, concerned primarily with environmental and social policy. So and what we do in these projects is we analyze and code legislative outputs for OECD countries in these 3 different policy areas over several decades. So we look at the legislation, including both laws as well as regulations, and code these laws and regulations with regard to the question whether they introduce new policy targets or new policy instruments. So we have overall, starting in 1976 in morality policy, even going back to 1960, year by year, we checked the relevant legislation and looked in the different laws and counted the changes and analyzed the changes in policy targets and policy instruments. So we looked both into the introduction of new elements, but also coded the abolition of existing ones. And if you look at the net effect, and that is just here, I show you just the graphs for the different countries. This is now just for social policy. You see that in our countries, we're looking 21 countries we're looking at, you see a considerable increase in policy elements over time. And this is, for social policy, is quite interesting, because this is typically, social policy is characterized as a rather mature policy field. You should expect that there's not so much going on, because that's a very well settled area. And also you might think, well, this is an area where a lot of restructuring, welfare state dismantling, austerity, all these structural challenges are going on. But nevertheless, you see considerable trend of policy accumulation. But you also, of course, also see there is variation across countries. Even more pronounced is the pattern. You also see it if you look at the vertical axis. You have different scales here as well compared to social policy. Much more massive increase in environmental policy. So considerable accumulation over time. And here, this is maybe less surprising because that's a rather young policy area which took off basically from the 1970s onwards. So that it's not so surprising that there's a considerable dynamic because of the problem pressure, strong problem pressure in the field. And finally, a brief look at morality policy. And again, this is particularly interesting because this is a field where you basically talk about liberalization. So we talk about liberalization of abortion, liberalization of euthanasia in many countries, liberalization of prostitution policies in many countries, liberalization of gambling, and so on. So policy areas where you should expect in terms of the, the political rhetoric, you should basically expect that there is a decline in the number of policy elements, but what we observe is exactly the opposite. It's not that strongly pronounced as it is the case for environmental or social policy if you look here at the scale, but still there's an increase also in this area. And this is insofar interesting because what you see here, if you had that you see this relationship between liberalization that comes along, it comes with an increase in regulation. Yeah, that is an argument that has made by several authors before. So liberalization does not mean that you have less regulation, but you have, on the contrary, you have more regulation. In the case of market liberalization, this means you need new policies defining market access, market operation, but a similar pattern you can also observe here in the field of morality policy. So what the basic conclusion is that regardless of the policy field we're looking at, you see this trend towards ever more policies. It's, of course, we have variation in country developments, but also variation across policy areas. But overall, is quite a clear trend that governments continuously do more and more. So policy stocks grow up over time. So this immediately leads to the question why this is the case. How can we explain it? And there's one argument is that there's a constant demand for new policies. So politicians, governments respond to societal demands, and these demands might emerge basically for functionalist reasons. You have technological progress, you have the invention of the internet, for instance, and then you need bundle of regulations to steer, to achieve a certain governance of the internet, for instance. You have societal modernization, you have societal differentiation, more pluralistic societies, which all of these different groups demand certain specific legislation, specific claim that there are certain problems they face that need to be addressed by the government. So there's a continuous stream of problems, and responsive politicians who want to be re-elected, they respond to these demands by suggesting, developing new policies. And of course, also globalization can be considered as such a functional driver, if you like. This is one side. There's the demand, continuous demand, and just for responsive governments develop new policies in response to this demand. Yet there's also supply side. So regardless of the demand, there is a supply of new policies. One factor that is crucial here is party competition, so electoral competition. So political parties try to mobilize voters. They pick up certain problems of their clientele, their voters, and propose policies to satisfy their voters. So this electoral competition is one factor that, of course, constitutes a crucial driver of such developments, the adoption of new policies. They are also court decisions, depending on the different constitutions in countries, but sometimes court decisions might force governments to adopt new policies, to regulate issues they have not regulated before, or to change existing regulations. Then, of course, we have the whole international level, international organizations. Countries have to implement policies adopted at the international level, or at the, of course, for EU member states. Of course, the EU is a very important producer of rules, of regulations. Member states have to comply with, have to implement, have to transpose into national law. Then there's a literature, organizational theory, bureaucratic theory that also emphasizes that there's kind of internal and endogenous bureaucratic dynamics that foster or drive the growth of policies, the growth of rules, because the bureaucracies needs rules for that structure that guide the policy application, the concrete implementation of policy. So it's to some extent this argument also raised by Mettler about policy maintenance. The concrete application needs specification, needs more concrete identification of how rules in different constellations have been applied, have to be monitored, have to be controlled. And so there's also this argument in the literature about rules breed rules, and so that the bureaucracy as such is a highly strongly pronounced driver of such rule developments, because the bureaucracy needs rules for implementing existing rules. And finally, there's a discussion. Of course, now I always talked about new rules, the adoption of new policies. One might, of course, argue, well, it's not necessarily needs not to be the case that we just adopt new rules and do not abolish existing ones. Why not substituting existing policies? Why do we have this dominant pattern of addition, rather than substitution to existing policy portfolios? And there's a literature starting also in the 1970s with American policy scholars focusing on policy termination, policy dismantling. They soon identified that policy termination is a highly unlikely scenario. Also, we in the consensus project, we were explicitly focusing on also on issues and instances of policy dismantling in social and environmental policy, and we found only few instances where countries actually really abolished existing policies. And the argument you find in the literature is just it's not very popular for governments, for politicians to do this, because there's always a group, mostly also often highly well-organized groups, who benefit from the status quo and mobilize against any change or abolition of the status quo. So there's a high, let's say, stickiness of existing policies. That's also why we often observe layering rather than substitution of existing policies. So it's only under very rare constellations you might really benefit as a political party seeking election or seeking office if you formulate programs arguing for the dismantling or termination of, let's say, social or environmental policy or whatsoever. So it's politically unattractive. Then you could say, well, maybe economic crisis, big crisis could drive decline in the number of policies. So if you have strong economic pressures, or in terms of austerity, for instance, this should mean that you might cancel existing social policies, cut back social spending. So crisis might help to reduce the stock of policies. But also here, it's also a paper we did with Xavier. What we found is not so much that we see termination or dismantling, but it's rather that crises lead to shifts in policy attention across policy areas that are remote to the crisis or policy areas that are proximate to the crisis. So crisis remote policies, we even see an increase in policy activity, whereas policy areas that are remote to the crisis, you see a certain stagnation. Don't see a decline, but you see stagnation in the policy development. So for instance, if you have economic crisis, then you see a strong increase in policy activities in related areas, economic policy, but to some extent also social policy, because you have a high unemployment, for instance, and governments need to do something about that. And you see, we found rather stagnating developments in remote areas, such as morality policy, for instance, which is not directly to economic development. But the crucial point, again, here, crisis might kind of reallocate dynamics of policy increases, of policy accumulation, but they don't lead to dismantling or a reduction, reversal of this accumulation trend. It's at best, we might observe for some periods stagnation of policy development. Okay, so far, I talked about the concept of accumulation. I talked about the potential causes of accumulation. I'm now turned to the consequences of policy accumulation. So basically, you could say, well, what is bad about policy accumulation? At first glance, you would say nothing, because it, in many ways, reflects societal progress. So we won't live, most of us would not like to live in a country that, that has where the state of environmental regulation is that of the 1950s, or where you have a social policy that reflects the state of the 1920s or 1930s. So we are all happy that we have that our governments have developed rules over time that helped to resolve important societal problems. So new regulations, new policies in many, many ways are highly important to resolve societal problems. So it's progress, it's modernization. So as such, new policies are nothing we should complain about. Also, you could say, well, it is also good in terms of a perspective, in terms of democracy, if you like. If you have politicians that are highly responsive to societal demands, that are open to problems from various parts in society and try to respond to that. So also from a democratic theory perspective, this should be a very welcome development. So this is the plus side, if you like, with regard to policy accumulation, but there's a big but. There are certain problems that come with policy accumulation in the long term. And this is what we refer to as democratic responsiveness trap in the book I showed you in the beginning of the presentation. So we argue basically that democratic responsiveness drives policy accumulation, yeah, and that this accumulation process comes along with three central problems I will talk about in a minute, namely a problem of political communication, if you like, referring to policy debates, a problem referring to policy implementation, and also policy evaluation problem, which overall, these three problems lead to a reduction or challenge democratic legitimacy, both in terms of policy effectiveness, so the policies that have been developed are more and more unlikely to achieve their goals, and also in terms of what is referred to as input legitimacy, so the participation of the electorate, of the population in the policy-making process that is essentially captured by this policy debates aspect. So overall, we have a reduction in the challenge to democratic legitimacy. And this again leads governments to even more respond again via adopting ever more policies. So it's kind of a problematic cycle. We have here a vicious cycle, if you like, and this is why we refer to that as democratic responsiveness trap. So on the one hand, governments try to respond to societal demands. In so doing, they produce these three problems, essentially. This again reinforces this kind of accumulation developments. So now let me turn to these three problems I mentioned. So the first one is, as I said, refers to what we can, what others have called input legitimacy, or what which also could be called problem of political communication capacity. So the problem is basically that policy accumulation increases complexity. So we have more and more policies in a given sector, and this makes it increasingly difficult for policymakers to communicate with voters, also to explain why we have adopted certain policies, how these policies relate to the existing policy stock. So the problem is that the policy space is not empty, but it's increasingly crowded. And as soon as you propose a new policy measure, you have to explain to the voters how this measure relates to the measures that are already in place. And this might be extremely complicated. There are many examples. We had some pension system reforms in Germany, for instance, in recent years. And there had been cases that the voters simply did not understand the reform. They applied for a new schemes and then ended up with lower pension rates than they had before. And they could not calculate that. It was too complicated for them to understand this. This is only one example to illustrate that the more crowded the policy space is, the more difficult it is to explain to voters why you do certain things. It's more difficult it is for the voters to understand what is going on. This would require, if you would like to do this, you need time and space in media channels. Yeah, and imagine talk shows, usual talk show formats. You maybe have 30 seconds to explain something or to talk about any reform that is on the agenda. And you would also need an audience who would really be interested in that, who would be willing to listen, to watch this. Also, the same applies to the press, if you like, to newspapers. And what we observe, and this is especially Christian Adam, who has worked on that and has shown that there's an increasing gap between public debates and discussion in highly specialized expert groups. So it's more and more kind of elite circles who understand what's going on, but the public, the general public, is more and more decoupled from this process. So You can also, if you take, for instance, climate change, yeah, if you look into the debates, the public debates, these are at a very abstract level. So it's about, yeah, are you in favor or against of climate change? And of course, everybody's in favor, but as soon as you talk about the concrete trade-offs, the situation looks a bit different. But basically, it's a highly abstract discussion. You hardly find a very specialized discourse about specific instruments, how different instruments, for instance, taxes, trading schemes, regulations might interact with each other. So this is nothing that the general public would easily digest. Yeah, it's a highly specialized discussion, and it's more and more difficult to communicate what you are doing. And this is overall a challenge to what has been referred to as input legitimacy. Now, the second challenge. This is basically a challenge we are especially focusing on in the ERC project, the Accupol project, the challenge for implementation capacity. So what is important and is often overlooked is that if you accumulate policy outputs, this is also an accumulation of implementation burdens for those bodies, agencies that are in charge of policy implementation. And it's very interesting pattern insofar as you have the ministerial bureaucracy, those who formulate the policies. For them, it's a kind of, one in, one out. They formulate a new policy, then the policy is transferred to the implementation level, and the policy formulators turn to the next problem. But at the desk of the implementation bodies, these policies are accumulating over time. So the burden for the implementers is increasing with every new policy. And there is a risk that there's a growing gap between these burdens and the capacities of these implementation bodies. And so these implementation bodies need to develop strategies how to cope with that. They can, of course, be selective. They might prioritize certain issues over other issues. But overall, we should expect there is an increase in the prevalence of implementation deficits. And just to give you a very basic illustration, this is just the number of public changes in public sector employment over time in the countries we are looking at. And you see here, this is a trend of overall stagnation or even a slight decline over time. And this is a very sharp contrast to this accumulation rates, these increases in the burdens, in the policy burdens that emerge from policy accumulation in the graphs I showed you before. So there's a risk of a growing implementation gap, a structural deficit of implementation that results from policy accumulation. Finally, we also argue that accumulation makes policy learning more difficult. It undermines our capacities for effectively evaluating policies. And this simply comes from the fact that as soon as the policy space is crowded, we would need to evaluate new measures and also their interactions with existing policy elements to really learn about the effect, which measures actually achieved which effects. You need to be aware of the multiple interactions occurring between different instruments in existing policy portfolios. And it's just an illustration here. Over time, you see you have more and more elements in a policy portfolio, and you might have to consider, for evaluating these measures, you might have to consider more and more interactions across these different elements. And the problem is just here on the left-hand side, the graph, this is an illustration, just a theoretical illustration here, the left-hand side, how the number of potential interactions increases with the number of policy instruments that are in place in a given policy portfolios. And you see this is kind of exponential increase, the more instruments you have, the more potential interactions between these instruments might occur. Now you could argue, well, this is a merely theoretical argument, but if you look at the right-hand figure, we just illustrated with data on policy change, the frequency distribution of changes in environmental policy we were studying. You see here we just plotted the numbers. You looked at how many changes, how many new instruments or new policy elements were introduced with one change. Yeah, and you see here you have many environmental policy. You have many changes where only one new element has been added, but you have also a lot of change instances where you have 5 or more new elements added to existing policy portfolios. And the same applies to social policy. So you see that with one change, with one legislative change, you might enormously increase the number of potential interactions between different elements in policy portfolios. So overall, this makes evaluations highly difficult. And it's not only that evaluations of policies are highly difficult, it's also that it's highly difficult for politicians like easy stories. Yeah, and such evaluations might lead to rather conditional arguments under which conditions, under which specific circumstances a certain new policy element might achieve its intended objective. So it's very difficult to, on the one hand, to communicate that to politicians, but also highly difficult to design fine-tuned policies that really take account of these different interactions. So let me conclude. This is my last slide. What can we do about it? Is there deregulation a solution? Why not deregulating? So it's a long discussion about deregulation, and it has been popping up regularly. And we argue that this might not be the really promising approach, because the problem is that deregulation overlooks that many of these policies that are accumulating are highly functional in achieving certain problems. So we need these policies. So of course, there might be some policies you might abolish which are dysfunctional, are ineffective. But overall, you cannot simply say, let's just cut back policies and we have resolved the problem. These arguments about one new policy in, 2 policies out, that has been suggested by the Trump administration, all these kind of forced solutions to cut back the number of policies did not really work, because what you observe was just a kind of shift from that policy elements have no longer been introduced by primary legislation, but rather by secondary legislation or even administrative circulars. So it did not really work. And also you might have less legislation, but even with one new law, you can introduce a lot of new policy targets and a lot of new elements. So the number of regulations, the number of laws does not tell you so much about the number of targets and elements that are added to the portfolio by a given law or regulation. So what we argue, what the most crucial thing is strengthening our democratic infrastructure to make this development sustainable, to avoid that. We argue you cannot stop accumulation, but you could keep it at a sustainable level, so that it can be digested both by the general public and also by the bodies in charge of implementing these measures. And one argument we have been advancing to recent papers is that about vertical coordination between those formulating the policy and those implementing the policy. And we argue that you basically, the more policy formulators also have to internalize the costs, the burden occurring at the implementation level, and the more the policy learning taking place at the implementation stage is integrated into the policy formulation process, that this is a kind of break to this accumulation process. It will not stop it, but it will kind of reduce the steepness of the curve a certain way. And that's something we also show in a recent paper, which is currently under review. And of course, there are certain other measures which we have not yet investigated in more detail, but of course you would need to sort of improve, to stimulate a more differentiated public discourse, maybe also to improve policy education, political education in schools, to give this political education higher prominence compared to other subject areas in schools. And there might be, of course, certain efficiency gains through digitalization, which have not yet been explored, which might help that at least the implementation problems might be somewhat reduced by developing, relying on digital technologies. But this is just something, I put there, which is up to discussion. We have not yet looked at that into more detail. Okay, that's it from my side. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christoph. You have some questions in the text, but I suggest people will come in and ask or comment directly. I see one end already there by Ido Sivan Sevilla. Ido, please.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Christoph. This was eye-opening in many, many ways. So thank you for this great talk. I do wonder if you can expand a little bit on the mechanisms that lead to policy accumulations from these three problems. Are these mechanisms explain policy accumulation based on rational choice theory at the individual level? So politicians want to create, the feeling of more responsiveness, so they create more policies because of the gap in the policy debates, because of the gaps in the implementation stage, etc.
Okay, shall I respond directly?
Yes, please. Please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Just to say this, Sachin, please, you can ask later on, but Christoph, go on.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think, it's a very good question. And actually, I have to admit that is still something we need to explore in more detail in the project. So far we just say that, like, so far we just assume that responsiveness drives policy accumulation, which is not yet proven. We have not yet investigated that in more detail. It's also part of the project. And I would say, for me, the basic mechanism is, I would prefer to call that political competition, party competition, which is, and we also see that we have one paper. We're looking at Singapore and autocratic systems, see to what extent there's a difference in accumulation between democracy and autocratic systems. We see, and also if you look at different democracies, the more pronounced political competition is, so that depends on the electoral system, if you like, so the likelihood that you are not re-elected, or the chances of re-election that vary from political system, electoral system to electoral system, that makes a big difference for this accumulation trend. So I think this is the basic mechanism we find or we would expect. What I mentioned with regard to these functional developments, so I mean societal differentiation, modernization, which is, I would say, this is a structural background development. Of course, there's an ongoing functional long-term at an abstract level, there's a certain development across all countries, but the extent to which this really materializes might strongly be affected by these competitive pressures in the electoral system. So it's basically party competition, competition for votes, competition for office. That's what I would expect, but still that's something we are working on, not yet fully driven home, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Sachin, and then Yanis, and then Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Christoph. Sorry, my camera is not working right now. There's some technical issues. So I come from India, and I see a lot of relevance of the policy accumulation and the regulatory accumulation also, if we want to call it. But the question is that when we say it is getting accumulated without any replacement or without terminating the previous policy, but we see that happens on paper. But if you look at de facto regulations or de facto what happens on the field, is actually the new policy starts rolling out and the earlier policy is forgotten. Probably it may be on paper. I mean, nobody cares about terminating that officially. But de facto it is still replaced. So in that sense, how do you cater to this situation in your policy accumulation concept?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's again a very good question, and actually we discussed that also in the book under the header of policy amnesia. So whether you do not formally abolish policies, but you just forget them over time. They're kind of outdated and no longer, so people no longer remind them. They're just no longer on the screen of the public, no longer on the screen of implementation bodies. So that's something that might happen. We did not find so many instances where this is actually taking place. And if you look, there might be some rare cases where certain, sometimes governments just forgot that there's still a law of 1921, which is officially in place, but anybody has ever heard about that, of that law. But basically most of the laws are still on the screens in these areas we have been looking at still of the public and also of the implementers. So there are still laws that burden the implementation bodies. They still have to deal with that. So I think it might be the case, and also it might maybe vary across different policy areas. And it's an interesting thing that might occur, also relate to this layering aspect. But actually, we did not find so much instances where we really could say this is sort of, de facto termination of policies by just adopting new policies.
Thank you, Christoph. Yanis, please. Please come in.
Yes, thank you very much, Christoph. This is extremely thought-provoking. Let me first offer perhaps two comments, and then I come with a question. My first comment is that I think your two first conclusions are extremely alarming for democratic accountability, because you have two powerful indicators. The one is the gap, the divorce between the political spectacle and the policy debates that take place in the backstage. And the other indicator is the fact that the unelected seem to be empowered because of the role that implementers play in the policy process. So I think we can derive quite negative conclusions about the impact it's interesting because it's responsiveness originally that leads to gaps in accountability. My second comment, and I would like to challenge you a bit based on your last conclusion. On the one hand, you say that we need this policy accumulation. There's a functional need and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you say, well, policy evaluation becomes more complicated, hence evidence-based policy is more complicated, is more difficult. So maybe the policies that are generated do not derive from functional requirements. Maybe it is partly competition, as you say, but it's maybe unrelated with functional requirements, hence less necessary. So this is perhaps my second more provocative comment. And then my question. Well, you know, there is veto point theory, and based on veto point theory, we would not expect such an accumulation because there are obstacles to reform, Reformstau, as you say in Germany. So what happened? Does this mean that veto points do not matter, that they can be overcome, that they matter less than they used to matter in the past? To me, this is a question. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Yanis. Thanks, first of all, for the comments. Actually, I would fully subscribe to your assessment. The first point, that it is really, these are really problematic consequences, and we argue that these are also, especially long-term consequences. It's difficult to say, to give you kind of tipping point, and then from then onwards, they might really have big problems. But it's this kind of creeping development that over time might undermine democratic legitimacy, and also might fuel all these developments we observe in many countries with regard to populist tendencies, which, of course, might not be only driven by accumulation and legitimacy concerns, but I think there's a relationship here. I also think you arrive at the second comment, and indeed that you have this kind of, that you no longer, the more difficult it is to develop evidence-based policies or problems that are really targeted towards a problem, the more indeed you might produce policies that are ineffective. Yeah, and there's also here, I would fully agree to that point. Now the question, the veto players, that's a very good question. Actually, we tried, also Xavier has been involved, Christian, Adam, Xavier and I did a paper 5 years ago in Policy Sciences where we analyzed the accumulation rates in social and environmental policy, and looked at the factors that account for these developments, and we also looked into the institutional constraints arguments, and actually we did not find an effect. And my explanation would be, and I think that's something that has a more general implication for political science, is that as soon as we apply very long time horizons going beyond the usual short-term 5 years, 10 years perspective, if you apply, we looked at 30, 40 years time period, then these institutional explanations no longer seem to have very strong explanatory power. So they might explain in the short term why you have a country with few veto points that might adopt certain reforms 2 years earlier than a country with higher veto points. But in the longer term, these factors do not seem to make a big difference across different systems. So that would be my interpretation. But at least we did not find any effect of these institutional factors.
Thank you.
Kerem, and then Mir, and then we will conclude. Elena, as well, but if you have the time, Christoph.
Yeah.
So let's go with Karen first.
Thank you very much for your very nice intervention. And then the book is still in my to-do list. I'm very much looking forward to reading it, giving it more like a deeper reflection. If you have mentioned, apologies if I have missed it, but if I wonder if accumulation is a bit like always like undesirable, especially if we consider the possibility of overloading a set of policies. I mean, meaning not accumulating is not doing so might reduce effectiveness or cause policy failures or fiascos. I mean, like with policy overloading, I mean, I would just, I mean, it could be the other extreme case, perhaps like depending too much on a single policy or like a few policies, rather than like adding like layering these like existing ones. So I just like to wonder if accumulation is undesirable or what, or under what conditions this might be like the challenge of it. Yeah. Thank you.
So I have to apologize. I had difficulties in understanding you. The transmission, the voice was not very well understandable for me. So I repeat what I understood from your question. And maybe you tell me whether I got it correctly. You asked whether there are different constellations, and sometimes accumulation might be good, and sometimes accumulation might be bad. Did I get that correctly?
I mean, like, I wonder if, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder if accumulation is like almost or say like always like undesirable, while we might rely on like a few policies or like say like a single one, but like which might mean overloading, like depending on like too much on a few set of like a policy rather than adding like attaching more and more along with the existing ones. So I wonder if like they not accumulating would reduce effectiveness and or cause policy failures or fiascos.
Yeah, I think I don't know. Maybe some of you might have seen there was a recent publication in Nature about how human beings resolve problems, and they did this on the basis of an experimental design, and asked people to, there have been certain tasks they should fulfill, problems they had to resolve, and there was always the option they could add new elements to something in order to resolve the problem, or they could reduce elements to resolve the problem. And I don't exactly remember the number, but more than 90% of the participants in these studies added new elements in order to resolve this experimentally designed problem, although the solution might have been much more effective if we had kind of reduced existing policy elements. So there was these two options, but there was this argument. There seems to be let's say the default mode of human beings is to add something new. When you have a new problem, you always, the first hunch is to add something new rather than thinking of whether you could abolish something. And I think for me, I found it very inspiring. I think that would be the crucial thing. And I cannot come up with a clear answer in which constellations adding or subtracting, reducing might be the better approach, but it would be worth to maybe also to institutionalize this in the policy formulation bodies, in the ministries. If you have a new problem, so in the first place, think what we can do, how we could, wouldn't it be better to just abolish some rules? Wouldn't that be the better solution rather than constantly adding something new? And so I think I'm not so sure whether I really responded to your question, but I think that would be the crucial requirement. And it's of course very difficult to come up with general ideas under which conditions one option or the other one would work better. But I think I found when reading that, I found it extremely inspiring, and thought of that we should find ways to apply this, transpose this to our study of policy accumulation.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I have 2 questions. The first is about the trend of accumulation. Accumulation trends seem to be constant in some countries and some policy area. Does it mean necessarily stagnation in accumulation, or do we see an alternative model in the sense of adopting new policies and at the same time dismantling policies? When do we find such stagnation, and when do we find such adoption and dismantling policies at the same time? And the second question is about legislative instruments and the difference between them. So the data you used for the project is based on the analysis of laws, regulations, and guidance, where you mainly focused on policy instruments and targets. But when taking into account the legality theory or the democratic theory, there are some differences between legislative instruments in their functions, in their visibility, in their numbers. Would it be useful to speak on single accumulation of any such instruments, on law accumulation, or perhaps on guidance accumulation, regulatory accumulation? Is there any differences between them? Do you think it matters? I think I'll stop here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I start with the second point. I think, yeah, that would be very interesting. I think indeed we did not do this yet, but it would be interesting to check also the extent to which there is a correlation between what we measure as policy accumulation in terms of accumulation of policy elements and maybe the accumulation in the numbers of regulations or even word counts of regulations. I can only maybe what is interesting is one of the co-authors of the book, Steffen Hurka. He has a big project now analyzing the complexity of EU law, EU regulations, and he looks at quite different indicators, capturing the extent to which these laws are more or less complex in terms of linguistic complexity. So he takes established linguistic measures. He looks at the relations between these norms, to what extent the regulations refer to other regulations, and so on. So he uses a range of different indicators. And also here, it might be interesting to look at the extent to which we observe correlations. I think I would not claim that what we count as policy accumulation is similar to rule growth or law accumulation, because in that you measure different things. If you look at rule growth, you count rules, we count policy elements. So I think that these are different concepts to some way. They are related, but they are different. The first question, patterns. I think what you observe is we try to do this to show is in a recent paper we published with Regulation and Governance, focusing on policy accumulation on asylum policy. We see that there is a certain ratcheting effect. You have crisis, we have problem pressure, and then we have steep increases in the number of policies. So crisis drive policy accumulation in the affected sector, and then you have a more stable development until the next crisis occurs and again pushes your portfolio size upwards. So the interesting thing is you rarely observe dismantling. So the usual pattern is just stagnation or accumulation, increase. And also a question whether you see this combination. it is true, but I remember in the consensus data set, we found this, that there is a certain correlation between accumulation coming with some dismantling, but you have to see the numbers are extremely diverging. You have very high number of accumulation, very, very few instances of dismantling. We have not systematically looked into that in the sense that there is a causal linkage between the two. But my explanation would be that if there's something going on, there's something, it might be the case that you add a lot to the policy stock, and you might, for some technocratic reasons, technical reasons, you might abolish certain things. But there is overall, we have too few instances of dismantling to really identify such relationships in a way.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And now, Elena, the last question before we close formally.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation and the opportunity to ask a question. I have noticed in your data, I have two questions. So first question relates to the REFIT program, so better regulation by European Commission. So I understand that you have country-specific, say, accumulation numbers, but I was wondering whether you saw any effect of this better regulation program agenda of the EU Commission. And if not, because I don't seem to see it in the trend, so I was wondering whether it's a different way to look at it. So this association and impact of REFIT. And another question, it relates to solutions for accumulations, because I come from the Netherlands. Here we have a lot of policies on environmental policy. So a lot of different fields. I'm sure everyone recognizes that as well, who's busy with environmental policy. And they have recently been undertaking some, let's say, policies to actually unite different policies, to integrate different policies. So I was wondering whether policy integration could be an answer to this, and how would you view the success stories of such attempts to integrate different policy sectors and the impact to accumulation? Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Two very interesting questions. The first one, the better regulation initiative. It's difficult because in this project, we did not really look into systematically check these effects. We did one study where we looked at environmental policy of the EU and how it was affected by the financial crisis from the 2008, 2009, 10 onwards. And we found, and that was interesting, that the Commission, the EU Commission, we observe a stagnation in the development of new environmental policies, which in our interpretation was basically a result of avoiding any economic, any burdens for the economic sector in order to facilitate economic recovery and so on. But when we did interviews, what the basic argument we always got was that also this better regulation initiative was kind of used as a resource within the Commission, because you have this debate. The DG Environment wanted to suggest new policies, and overall the Commission did not want to have these policies. For these economic reasons, they used this kind of better regulation initiative as a resource to sort of stop or undermine this development, and to reduce this dynamic. But this is, I think, is a very specific case, where you have this coincidence of economic crisis plus this better regulation. So that's the only, let's say, evidence or where I could give you an answer on that. So we did not really look at this in our data. If we assume that, and we don't find a systematic difference between EU and non-EU members, so that speaks does not speak for a strong effect of this initiative, at least in the national data, I would say. The second thing, policy integration, that's a very good argument and a good question. I think it depends, because if you integrate different legal frameworks into an integrated scheme, this could mean that the number of your targets you're addressing, the number of instruments you're using remain more or less the same. It could also be that you kind of integrate in a way that you redefine targets, redefine instruments, integrate targets in a way. Then you would, I would say, then this would also mean a reduction. But from the outset, I think it's very difficult to answer. Whether it's more kind of merely formal legal integration, then I would not expect many effects. Or whether it's really this policy integration. And it could even be that, depending how often the things, if you try to do this, these are probably often the things are more complicated than expected. You could even increase the policies, because you need, for the coordination of the policies, the application, you might need more of this, let's say, management on coordination policies across different sectors. So from the outset, I would say difficult to tell. Sorry, it's kind of a bit ambiguous, but I can't. Yeah, I find it hard to judge from the outset.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Christoph. I think we'll finish here formally. We'll close the recording, and if you have a few more minutes and you want to chat with the people, or people wants to chat, please stay with us. Thank you very much, all of you, and Christoph for sure.